So, good evening. My name is Marc Mosset. I'm a Senior Director of Government Affairs at Microsoft Europe. I'm super happy to be here tonight, and it's very good to see you in this new EBC, because I have to say that we have refurbished this space, and it's a new EBC, and you are really fortunate to be in this space tonight with William and Paul. Thank you to join us for this book talk. I don't know if you remember, but we launched the book talk about 1 year ago. It's a series of book talk to discuss new ideas, new concepts on policy, politics, technology. And I have to say that this is really a good time to discuss on new concepts and sometimes maybe breakthrough concepts. So tonight I'm really happy to welcome and to host William to talk about his book. I have to say we just had a very short exchange a few seconds ago, and I was saying with my very French accent. So reading his book, it came to my mind the book of Francis Fukuyama, if you remember, The End of the History, The Last Man. And for Fukuyama, it was the end of the story because the universalization of liberal democracy was everywhere. And it was the end of the story, and we were just exchanging, saying, maybe this is now the start of the story. So really, we are really fortunate to have you. William, I will just give you, and I will read some information on William. You know him, but it's really impressive, because William is a non-resident fellow, senior fellow at the Center on the United States and Europe at the Brookings Institute. For 10 years, William served as president of the American Council on Germany and previously was a founding executive director at the Transatlantic Center in Brussels. So you know well the bubble Brussels. So you know Europe. And this center was created in 2001 by the German Marshall Fund. And of course, it's very important to remind that William served as chief European correspondent at the Washington Post until 2001, if I'm not wrong. So you have been an observer of the EU during this time, before the start of the history, which is now. And so your book, I have it here, and I encourage you, if you want to buy it at the corner after the room at the end of this event. Is really, I had the opportunity to go through. It's really interesting, and it reminds us how democracy, prosperity is not so easy to sustain. And it reminds us how this story is something that could be challenged all along the time. At the end of the 20th century, we were quite sure that the Western Europe will be the new superpower in the world, and the West at the dawn of a new era. We are close to a new era. I just hope that it will be still a new era dominated by democracy. I'm super optimistic, but I would love that through your travel across Europe, we have a chance to discuss this. And Paul Taylor will be the moderator. Paul is a senior fellow at Friends of Europe, so he knows very well Europe. He speaks French. And we have a friend in common who is living, I don't know if there is French, in Meudon. So I'm super happy to be in Brussels to talk to someone who knows Meudon, where I'm living when I'm in France. So it's really impressive. And so Paul has been the chief correspondent in France for some years. And now he is working for Politico as a European Affairs editor, having the column on this in Politico. So I'm super happy to have you moderating this book talk. I'm super happy to have you on stage now, because I talked a little bit too much. As Fidel Castro said often, I will talk very briefly, and 5 hours after he was still on stage. So I'm leaving, I'm not Fidel Castro, but William and Paul is to you now.
Welcome, and thanks to Microsoft for hosting this event. He's told you something about Bill Drozdiak, a lot about Bill Drozdiak, but let me start with his darker past. I mean, this guy was a professional basketball player in Belgium almost throughout the 1970s. He went to the Collège de l'Europe, where he met his charming wife, who's Belgian, and was a senior Belgian diplomat. And I first met Bill in 1983, when he moved to Bonn as the Washington Post's Germany correspondent, West Germany as it then was. And we collaborated together to expose the fake Hitler diaries. First time we'd met, and we had tremendous fun doing so. It wasn't terribly difficult, actually. The stunning thing was how anybody managed to take these to be genuine. And we've been friends and buddies and partners in many crimes ever since. It's a delight. His book, I think, I can warmly recommend to you as a great read. It's written by a journalist, and that shouts out of every page. It's full of observation. It's full of characters. European politics is not grey in this book, but it's multicolored and multifaceted. And the book betrays, I think, the fact that Bill has had tremendous access and contacts in many capitals of Europe. And obviously, the former president of the American Council of Germany, as you would expect, he has a tremendous view of how things work in Germany, and had a ringside seat during the crisis in a period when Germany, and Angela Merkel specifically, was carrying the whole world's woes on her back. And that is very well, I think, reflected in the book, the access that Bill had to her inner circle and to her view of the world. So that, too, I think, is very exciting. And finally, and we'll come on to this in our questions, this is a book written in a way by an American who's become very angry about the state of his own country. And the last chapter, which looks at fractures in Washington as well as on this continent, and how the interaction between what's happened in Washington and the troubles of Europe, I think is really enlightening. So I would recommend that anybody who hasn't already read it reads it, and we'll take it from there. So let me start by saying, Bill, you have a diagnosis about what went wrong with the European project. Where do you trace it back to? Did Europe overreach, and when did that happen?
I think, like any tragedy, it's often rooted in a sense of victory or hubris. And when the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union and its empire disintegrated, as Marx said, I think that was the time when Francis Fukuyama wrote his book about the end of history, basically saying this was the triumph of liberal democracy over communism, over every other ideology, and that a lot of the world then aspired to become liberal democracies. So at the time, Chancellor Kohl and Francois Mitterrand, the president of France, considered how Europe would move forward, and they decided on three great initiatives. One, to anchor Germany in Europe through a single currency, in which Germany would reluctantly give up the Deutsche Mark, and that would be accomplished within 10 years by the creation of the euro. Two, to show citizens that Europe could make a tangible improvement in their lives by having free flow across borders through the Schengen Treaty. And then third, to embrace the new democracies in Central Europe that had thrown off the shackles of communism and had become once again part of the West. And so the feeling was, we cannot leave them out in the cold. We have to expand the two great institutions of the West, the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to embrace them. But that took the NATO in particular right up to the borders of what became Russia once again, and engendered a lot of fear and retribution, as we have now seen with Putin. And so over time, I think there was a sense of triumphalism led to complacency, and that these three great initiatives somehow went off the rails. The euro, we saw, was not built to accommodate a one-size-fits-all monetary policy that could handle a developed economy like Germany or Sweden or Netherlands versus Greece and even Spain and Portugal. And then the refugee crisis brought home the fact that the Schengen Treaty did not account for a securing of the periphery. So there was, when confronted with these refugees, there was no way to deal with the crisis. And then finally, the expansion of NATO and the EU led to Russia and a resurgence of aggressive nationalism that was manifest first in the attack on Georgia, and more recently the annexation of Crimea and the involvement in eastern Ukraine. And these three issues, I believe, have created the doubts that led to the rise of populist nationalism. And I still think that these three areas will create the future crises that Europe has to face until it finds a way to resolve the contradictions at the heart of the single currency, until it shores up its immigration and its frontier policy in dealing with refugees, and last but not least, finds a way to manage relations with Russia.
Yeah. So, is there a common thread in the methodological approach of the EU that led to these three, which was seen as three ambitious advances in European integration, sort of falling on their face?
Well, methodology?
Yeah.
Well,
did Europe go about it the wrong way?
Well, I think any time, first of all, with the expansion of the European Union, the institutions were not prepared for reaching consensus on all these issues. So you had what became the least common denominator. And I remember Javier Solana, when he took over the job of the foreign policy czar, he said, yes, my title is, I'm the high representative for the least common denominator. And that became, sort of symbolic of what Europe was looking for. But as a result, rather than having bold and ambitious policies, it retreated, and certainly after the defeat of the EU Constitution, that set Europe back on its heels. But most of all, it was the 2008 financial crisis that led to depression, a serious economic depression in places like Greece, in Spain with the bursting of the housing bubble, where you had 50% unemployment of young people, and that disillusioned a lot of the younger generation with the European Union, because suddenly the prospect of ever-growing prosperity was no longer the case.
Do you think there are any of those three major policy initiatives that the EU would have done better not to attempt? Should they have slowed down or not done the Eastern enlargement? Should they have gone to, François Mitterrand, for example, was talked about a European confederation with the countries that emerged from the communist system rather than membership. Was that a mistake, do you think? Or was it just the management of Russia that was wrong?
I was in Europe reporting at that time, and I was very aware of the debates that were going on. And I firmly believe that the decisions taken at the time were the right ones. Whether they were carried out properly is still open debate. I think on Russia, certainly it would have been really a crime and a humanitarian error not to embrace countries that had struggled to get rid of communism and to leave them exposed like that. This was actually a return to the West. When you consider Prague is further west geographically than Vienna, and a lot of these these states, Hungary, part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they were all, and certainly the Baltic states, they all have looked west, and that's part of their history. So in a way, it was a return for them to the history and joining the Western democracies. I think a better care should have been taken in terms of dealing with the fragile Russian ego, the national ego. And I think there was even a time in the early 90s when people thought, well, maybe we should even bring Russia into NATO. Think about that. And that was entertained at one point in Washington as an idea, but Clinton discarded it. Now, I think there's the failure to understand the Russian mindset hurt Europe and the United States then, and as it does now. We still don't understand what is driving Putin, and we can get into that a little later. But just on the other two issues, on the single currency, certainly more care should have been done to maybe move toward a fiscal harmonization. That's, you know, to make it easier. But it was politically impossible to do. There was this feeling, Helmut Kohl was like a bulldozer. He always said, "Wir gehen durch," even if there was 70% opposition, as there was in Germany to this, he decided to go ahead with it. And all of his economists warned him about this. And then finally on the Schengen Treaty, I think the idea of crossing borders and interchanging with different cultures, I think one of the great successful policies of the EU has been the Erasmus program, which and young people who now feel comfortable in different cultures, different cities, different states, and form friendships there. I think that's one of the great achievements of the European Union and would have been fostered more. But nobody anticipated the refugee crisis of 2015 and 16 on the scale that it turned out to be, and because we didn't think that the Syrian civil war would generate such an ability to potentially destabilize Europe.
I mean, as we've seen with Brexit, it's the kind of combination, the association of the European Union with uncontrolled immigration, I put that in quotation marks, that has proved to be the most toxic thing, right? How does the EU cope with that?
With the
immigration, with the fact that it allows and insists on freedom of movement, with the fact that it needs more migrant workers but doesn't actually want them,
right.
And that it has international legal obligations to refugees, which it finds in practice very hard to discharge and unpopular to discharge.
Yes, exactly. And this is becoming the central political challenge for a number of governments. That how do you reconcile the need, as you point out, for more immigrants because of the demographic shortage of people that has been created in Europe over a couple of generations. I think I mentioned in the book, the German Interior Ministry every year has been issuing a report for at least a decade saying that Germany will require as many as 400,000 immigrants a year for the next 25 to 30 years in order just to sustain its current living standards. And other countries that have had low birth rates, including Italy and now Spain and in the south, will also require more and more immigrants to do the jobs that are going wanting. But that is now bumping up against the rise of populist nationalism that fears a dilution of their culture, the feeling that one no longer feels at home if you listen to these voices in the country that they were brought up in, and so this has created a lot of anger and nationalist sentiment and a populist extremism that is threatening Europe. It's interesting in Germany's case, the Interior Ministry this year, because of the political pressures felt, has dropped the figure now below 300,000, even though they still stand by their statistics, but they realize that it's politically unpalatable to hear that message at a time when the Alternative for Deutschland, with their anti-immigrant message, is now looms as the second biggest party in Germany.
So you don't think that populism in Europe has peaked?
No, I think it will continue to increase. It will be manifest in different ways.
Yeah.
I mean, we talk about, I think there are some hopeful signs, as we've discussed. There is a glimmer of economic growth on the horizon. There's a trajectory where things are moving ahead. I think in looking back on when I wrote the book, I submitted the manuscript, I think in December of 2016. The book came out in September of 2017. And when I wrote that, I mean, France was still in a dark period of morosité, but now I think there's a great sense of optimism that has greeted the first year in power of Emmanuel Macron. I think Greece is showing signs of emerging from its economic depression. Spain is showing some signs of growth as well. But I think in contrast, I was probably too optimistic. I think things are looking worse in terms of the East-West split. When you look at Poland and Hungary and how their authoritarian tendencies are causing major problems with Brussels, and also Italy. Italy is always on the brink. Though I think the title is Rome. The chapter on Rome is called "The Eternal City Forever in Decline." I mean, and the Italians say, yes, we've been in decline since the days of the Roman Empire, but somehow everybody's still wearing cashmere sweaters and beautiful La Bella Figura and La Passeggiata still looks very stylish.
All decline and no fall.
Yes. But we'll see on March 4th. This is an important election, whether it results in stalemate. The rise to power of the Five-Star Movement, a populist, even anarchist movement, you might say. And so that could create, and there is a serious banking crisis on the horizon there. So that could plunge the euro back into more difficulties. But and don't forget, I still think the unresolved issue of what Russia does next. I mean, because we in the United States have been obsessed by the investigation of Robert Mueller into collusion, possible collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia, and how Russia meddled in the presidential election. Well, Russia has been meddling in Europe's elections. It tried to do so in Germany and in France, and will continue to do so. Russian oligarchs have bought up important media properties in Bulgaria and Romania. So these efforts are going to continue. And that's why, if I could just elaborate a bit more on Russia, why I think the relationship with Russia is important. And I had, thanks to having known Chancellor Merkel for quite a number of years through the American Council on Germany and others, she offered some very interesting insights. She spoke to Vladimir Putin 70 times during the 18 months when I was reporting this. She spoke to either on the phone or in person. 7-0. And basically because President Obama outsourced the job of dealing with Putin. He didn't like Putin. They didn't get along. He said, Angela, you be the interlocutor for the West. And she speaks, of course, fluent Russian, having grown up in communist East Germany. He spoke fluent German because he was in Dresden as the KGB representative there at the time of the fall of the wall, which he called the greatest disaster to befall humankind in the 20th century, overlooking the Holocaust and a couple world wars. But she said when she would meet with him, she would try to say, you know, one of the greatest achievements that I'm proudest of as a German since World War II is that we have established peaceful and prosperous relations with all 9 of our neighbors. And she says, I don't understand why you want to pick a fight with the West, when if I were in your shoes sitting in the Kremlin, I would think the greatest strategic threat comes from the East. China is encroaching on Siberian territory, in fact, because Russia doesn't have the soldiers to protect it. Islamic fanaticism coming from the south. And so, if anything, you need the support of the West in dealing with these challenges. And by the way, I mean, in Munich, we were discussing this number of the One Belt, One Road initiative. The country that will be hurt the most by that is probably Russia. So you have a country sitting on oil and gas at a time when our civilization is moving away from using oil and gas as fuel as we move toward electric vehicles and that sort of thing. So the demand, there's going to be a steady deterioration. And you would think if you're Vladimir Putin, you would want to find a way to gain support rather than picking a fight with the West. But as one Russian told me in Munich, it said, we don't think in terms of that's a Western geopolitical strategy.
Yeah.
And what it comes down to is Putin and his cohort want to hold power and want to keep the money they've accumulated for personal reasons. And the Russian people, who have an immense capacity to suffer, will continue to accept this, at least for the time being.
Because he's made them feel good in some way.
Yes, and I think it's a sense he has imbued, in controlling the press, the media, this sense of proud Russia is back on its feet. The world is taking notice, and he's using asymmetric warfare, forms of warfare through disinformation, as we see in the chapter I wrote about Riga, is a capital where half the population is ethnic Russian. So half the people are getting their information from Russian media sources, the other half from Western sources. And so how that disorients the entire society is scary, but it's fascinating but scary.
I think it was a fascinating chapter, in fact, in your talk with the mayor of Riga. And the recognition, I think, there that, that the EU also, in a way, missed a trick because it didn't stand up for the rights of Russian speakers who were not citizens of Latvia when Latvia joined the EU. Oh, citizenship is a national competence. We don't decide who becomes citizen and doesn't. And therefore, it admitted a country, I suppose you could say, well, the same is true of Luxembourg, where almost half the population are not citizens, right?
Yeah. Well, and this is, they throw this charge of hypocrisy at us. Why aren't the rights of Russians, ethnic Russians who are born there, respected? They cannot vote until they fulfill a lot of strenuous conditions. And similarly, on the question of Catalonia, what the Spanish government is it right for a democratic government in Spain to lock up the political opposition in Catalonia? It doesn't look good when you're preaching to the world about free expression and human rights.
Do you think that's sort of part of the dynamic of European Union, that the borders of the member states themselves become less relevant, and the EU has always seen itself as a project, as a way of overcoming the nation state? We're talking about a post-national world where the EU was, we're all going to be happy Europeans together. And, they created things like the Committee of Regions, which was supposed to suggest that actually, there'd be the European level of governance, there'd be regions where people would have their local identity, and that layer of government in between, national governments, would wither away, a bit like the state in Marx. In that, it's kind of nationalism that's come back and bitten Europe in the behind, isn't it? I mean, certainly in the country that I used to think I knew best.
Well, I think, and that will continue to be the case as long as political power is determined by national elections. I mean, there's been an effort whether to find a way to elect the president of the European Commission in sort of a continental election, to move beyond the national voting patterns. As you said, the Europe of regions was once cited as sort of a more natural way of representing people. And I think there's some merit to that, because the backlash we see against globalization is, in a respect, and like regional separatism of the kind in Catalonia, is driven by the desire of people to be governed closer to their own communities. And the resentment they feel for a lot of wrong reasons toward the institutions of Brussels is driven by the fact that they believe that their daily lives are being intruded upon by faceless bureaucrats away in Brussels. And it's unfortunate, but that's human. And as long as you have the heads of government elected in national elections, and along with their personal foibles, you know, I think as a journalist, you want to write a book with not about statistics or institutions. You want to write human beings with flesh and blood.
Characters, right?
And I thought it was important to really report this as a journalist and go in when I would meet with people. I would try to absorb as much color as, from these what would seem to be lifeless all-night negotiating sessions of the European Council of Ministers. And fortunately, I got some interesting tidbits, like the standoff between Orban and Merkel, when he said, I'm erecting barbed wire fences all around my country to keep these immigrants out. And believe me, Madam Chancellor, you will be forced to do the same thing in Germany sooner or later. And she shoved her papers aside and stared at him. And he said, Mr. Prime Minister, I grew up staring at a wall in my face for 35 years, and I'm determined not to see more walls built in Europe. And it was a really eloquent moment that sort of brought the room into silence. And there were other lighthearted occasions. She had a difficult relationship with Nicolas Sarkozy, and Sarkozy once was angry with her and started making fun of her to his table mate, saying, look at her, she told me she's on a diet, and I see her taking a second helping of cheese. And this gets back to Merkel, so she's a bit angry. So when Sarkozy tries to make amends and said, Angela, you and I are the head and the legs of Europe. We have to get along. And she said to him, no, Nicola, you are the head and the legs. I am the bank. So it's those anecdotes that
right.
make this a human story.
Absolutely.
And show people that all these EU ministerial meetings are composed of human beings,
yeah.
and not just faceless bureaucrats.
Well, it's almost your time to ask us questions, so please start to prepare. When you do, tell us who you are and keep your question tight. I'm going to ask you one more while they're thinking what they want to ask you, Bill, which I have to say is about the country that I used to think I knew best and which deprived me of a vote in its referendum, the UK. Your Fractured Continent book doesn't really come to a conclusion as to whether Europe's going to break up or not. You leave the jury out. Maybe you wanted to write a sequel. I'm sure you did. But in one case, the fracture has already happened, right? Britain is on its way out. Do you see anything that's stopping that? And how do you see that relationship between the UK and Europe working thereafter?
Well, I think I've asked a lot of my British friends, who, both from the Leave and the Remain camps, when you look at the economic logic and the fact how young people are going to be penalized over time, this is so much against Britain's interests and also against the interests of Europe that there has to be a way for reason to prevail and reverse this looming train wreck. But to my amazement, everybody says it's gone so far. It will be practically impossible to reverse, and which is a shame. So there we are, faced with this this inevitability, and that will mean we'll have this continent on its own. I think it will reinforce the power of France at a time when it has a young, dynamic leader who is ambitious and wants to revive the country and reshape Europe. I think it's going to be a fascinating year to see how his relationship with Merkel develops and whether he can persuade Germany to take decisions that it's been reluctant to make in the past. But it's going to be necessary if Europe is going to move forward. But in terms of Europe's own ambitions, I really think that in order to preserve the Union, I referred earlier to these divisions, the décalage between the Eastern democracies, which jealously want to guard their sovereignty, and the West. And now we're going to have this fight over Poland, which gets 2 billion euros a month in subsidies from the EU, is now threatening all sorts of action if those subsidies are reduced. How does Europe find a way to remind everybody of the importance of sustaining key policies? And I think you're hearing more and more that maybe this is not the time to move ahead with too much of an ambitious single foreign policy, for example. Let's retrench, fortify a single market, concentrate on trying to rebuild the economy, get young people back into the workforce. Simple things, but important things that would regenerate more enthusiasm for Europe in the future.
That raises lots of questions. Sounds like there's a second book in that.
Hope so.
I'm going to shut up, and it's your turn. There are 2 microphones. Please raise your hand. And I'm going to pretend that I don't know who you are, so you have to tell everybody that you're Stefano Stefanini. Known to everybody in Brussels as Steph.
Stefano Stefanini at Atlantic Council, and I'm Italian. I won't bother you with anything else. Bill, I think your analysis of what happened, also the 3 steps that the EU took are impeccable. So I'd like to ask you something more about looking at the future. 2 questions, if I may. The first, in your you talk to lots of people. Your book is a mine of information. Did you detect within the sort of nationalistic, nativist, populist movement you call it way, also a desire for strong leaders, not necessarily strong men, strong women, but in terms of charismatic leaders, which there aren't that many around. In your pages, Angela Merkel does come out as carrying certain weight, but not so charismatic, or maybe some of that is lost. Mm-hmm. So, given the fact that if you look around in the world, there are several people who fit that pattern of sort of strong, maybe undemocratic, but if you want the leader, sometimes you throw away democracy or you put it. The second question is about Russia, but simply this: you said that Europe in general, right, has to sort of think about Russia. Given the current circumstances on the other side of the Atlantic, should Europeans try to figure out Russian policy by themselves, which has always been a looming danger in the transatlantic relationship, or wait and see, or because that's a real question. If Europe starts having a Russian policy, it might not coincide with the current American policy, especially considering in America, Russia has become a political football for domestic politics. Thanks,
Bill.
Sure. Okay, to your first point, Stefano, on strong leadership, I think there is a hunger on the part of European voters to see leaders who will stand up and do what they feel is the right thing, even if it's the unpopular thing. And I think the very peak of Angela Merkel's influence was when she took a decision that was very much in contrast to her normal personality. I mean, the Germans have even, they've turned her name into a verb. To Merkel means to procrastinate, you know, to take one step forward and see how everybody responds before you make the next decision. Well, when she first let in the refugees, which was a Saturday morning, she told me she woke up, she had had nightmares about that young Kurdish boy who washed up on the beach, and she couldn't reach the Austrian chancellor or other leaders, and so she decided to take what seemed like a bold, reckless decision, open the doors, let in all these refugees. And it was wildly popular for a number of weeks in Germany, because suddenly Germans felt good about themselves. It was the proper humanitarian thing to do. And Merkel said, you know, I was only reflecting the way I was brought up. She was raised by a Lutheran pastor who ran a disabled center, and every day he drove into her the message that, you know, you should always care for people who need help. And so that was the driving force. But then, as political opposition mounted over the months and first year, because how are we going to care for all these people when it was unfettered? And then she started backing away from this. I think she could have shown more leadership, but that's a difficult position. I think there are other examples where taking hard decisions will pay off in the long run, but it may not be political. And I think voters will reward people for that, and we've seen that in the United States as well. On your second point,
Managing Russia.
yes, on Russia, I think it's we in the United States are going through an impossibly difficult situation with a president who is now under the risk of criminal indictments. This could be far worse, more difficult even than the Watergate period. And so I wouldn't look for strong or consistent leadership from the United States. And as Merkel said, I think last May, it's maybe the time has come for Europe to take its destiny in its own hands. And I would urge my European friends to absolutely really think long and hard about this, because what we see in the United States, even if Trump were to be removed from office tomorrow and let's say a rational pro-Atlanticist president would take over, there are forces at work in the United States that are, that 70 years after World War II, are saying, why are we still protecting Europe? Isn't Europe wealthy enough and strong enough to care for itself? I was just on a book tour trip through the Midwest, and I heard this from a lot of political elites, including governors, who are saying, you know, I like Europe, but, you know, why is it we have so many problems at home, whether it's an opioid epidemic ravaging communities in the Midwest or lack of good infrastructure. We need to invest at home. We've been diverted by two colossal, blunderous wars in Iraq and Afghanistan for nearly 2 decades. And we don't have the time, the resources, or the attention to devote to, you know, maintaining this control for Europe. So I think sooner or later, better sooner than later, Europe needs to take control. And as I said, one of the biggest challenges will be how to manage relations with a Russia that I think is in long-term steady decline. And that makes Russia even more dangerous, other than the fact it's got 20,000 nuclear weapons. It's got a very devious capability now in information and cyber warfare. And how you find a way to combat this kleptocracy around Putin at a time when there's that he wants to push Russia even further as a way of showing the people that he has brought Russia back onto the world stage. So this is going to require a delicacy and a strength of leadership that will really test a lot of Europe. And I really think it's for Europeans to take the lead, particularly at a time when we have an American president who is now being openly charged with collusion with Putin and his government.
Next question, please. Sir. There's one here, and then the gentleman in the middle. Yeah, go ahead. You go
I'll
ahead
start over
first.
here.
You go first, and this gentleman here in the middle.
Hi, thank you. My name is Adrian Garcia. So my question, I wanted to pick up on a few things, I guess, and pick your brain on them. Here you just said that there was something of an appetite or a need for more strong leadership at the European level, and I will agree with that. You also mentioned a little earlier that the concept of political distance, or the reality of it, fuels separatism. And I would say it also, by extension, fuels populism. You know, I think it thrives on pointing to something far away and saying, you know, this is what is, hindering your opportunities. And so my question is, how do you kind of break out of that catch-22, where you have a room for and need for leadership at the European level, but also the fact that the counter reaction or the price of this is going to be more local issues, because you could try and bring in more local and regional political actors and bring them closer, or at least have more of a direct connection politically to Brussels. But then that starts to look more like a structured, almost federal political system. And in every member state, that concept, the debate around federalism, is in a totally different place. So you have political, social, and even structural concerns. And so I wanted to know whether in the course of your research for the book, or the conclusions you came to, there were at least threads that we can pick up on that bring those three together. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think, the reporting I've done over the last couple of years, both in Europe and the United States, tells me that this, in response to this backlash against globalization, the regional powers will become stronger, because that's where the voters want to see their desires attended to. And I think you see, you know, Germany is already very decentralized. The Länder have great individual powers, and even mayors do. You see it, I think Spain is going to have to move in that direction if it's going to somehow defuse this fight with Catalonia. Here in Belgium, of course, it's very decentralized between Flanders and Wallonia and Brussels region. And we'll see probably more of that in other countries, of this regionalization. I think the next place that's likely to erupt into potential political problem is Italy. There were a couple of non-binding referendums in the Venice area and Milan recently. The wealthy north is getting sick and tired of putting money down a black hole in southern Italy, and they want to invest the funds locally. I don't think it'll lead necessarily to breakup of Italy by any means, but more this tendency toward regionalization. And I might add, I see the same thing going on in the United States. The reaction to a divided and polarized country about Donald Trump and a dysfunctional Congress, where only 9% of the people have faith in their elected legislators, has been to reinforce the power and influence of state and local governments. I mean, Jerry Brown, the governor of California, which on its own would be the 8th largest economy in the world, now is making tours around Europe, basically saying, you know, we're going to conduct our own foreign trade and investment policy.
Climate policy.
And climate, of course. Right. Yeah, he's even adopting a global climate policy, because he says, but this all fits into what he says is part of the economic ecosystem of California. So more and more, I think regional leaders are doing that. And it's interesting, a younger generation of politicians are saying that I want to stay on the local level. I think I have an interview with the mayor of Copenhagen, who had been a prominent minister and was thought to be likely prime minister of Denmark. But he said, no, I have much more influence and greater satisfaction as a politician in creating a geothermal system for Copenhagen that heats 700,000 people, the homes of 700,000 people, and encourages discourages car riding, and so 70% of the people commute to work or school on bicycles. So you see the tangible achievements at a local level.
These are interesting examples also of how local responses are being found to new issues and new problems that may not be getting kind of the national attention, but are problems that you all encounter in daily life. Now, I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions in this round so that plenty of people get to ask, and I'm going to give a special premium to questioners of the female persuasion because I've had only male hands up so far. So, I'm going to take you, sir, and I'm going to take the lady over here, and then the gentleman over there. Faute de dame. Sir.
My name is Martijn Noel from the University of Leuven. And Bill, first of all, I'd like to congratulate you with this fantastic book. And certainly Financial Times was right to nominate it as one of the best 5 books written in 2017 in that manner. You know, I'm running quite a bit to Moscow. And I read your book, believe it or not, from Brussels to Moscow to Nizhny Novgorod and back. And I must say, fantastic book. So I'm pretty sure some things are left somewhere in Russia. I was very happy that when our Prime Minister, Charles Michel, left to see Putin a couple of weeks ago, and when he came back, he said something very interesting. He said, let's stop talking about Russia, let's talk with Russia. We discussed it a little bit. I think we have to talk to Russia. Maybe Merkel did it, but maybe not in the best way. I'm following now the Russian things for 7 years. I'm running roughly every month to Moscow and Nizhny Novgorod, and you name it, and you name it. In 2011, Medvedev and Putin decided that besides oil and gas and minerals, don't forget that, there are unbelievable good brains. History has proven that in Nobel Prizes. Take our own Prigozhin, Moscovite, Nobel Prize, etc. So since 2011, Medvedev and Putin decided, let's put it also on knowledge, which they are doing. And I'm following these 4 projects. Believe me, the Russians are coming back, not only with oil, not only with gas and minerals, also with knowledge. And when I'm discussing there, and I'm discussing at the highest level with Anatoly Shubais and Vekselberg and so on, I think in 5 years from here, they will have a nucleus of the new economy based on technology, because they were very lousy in valorization their knowledge. They never did it in the Soviet system, even a long time after that. I guarantee you that they are coming back. I guarantee you. I see it every month. And then I don't understand America, the United States of America, a country which I like so much. I lived there 20 years, etc. I was in November in MIT, the best school in the world, I think, engineering school. They have contracts with the Skolkovo project. And Skolkovo is paying hundreds of millions to get the exchange.
Can we get to the question, because there are a couple of other questions waiting.
So my point is, we should talk to them instead of talking about them. And I think there are a lot of interesting things in that country called Russia. Of course, we know a lot of negative things, yes, of course. But let's consider the positive things. And if we don't watch them, they will do it with China and not with Europe.
Okay, positive approach to Russia. Madam.
Hello. Not working?
That's
yes,
it.
Yes. Hi. So just in terms of what you said, both Leavers and Remain, your friends.
I think the lady's asking about the UK.
Maybe my accent gives it away, I don't know. You know, just in terms of both, perhaps it's unclear in terms of, we don't know from at least my government's perspective, we're still not quite clear on where the negotiations are going. But just in terms of it being kind of normative, especially in this place that we say, you know, it's been a very bad decision on part of the UK, can you not see yourself purely, you know, not even evoking emotions, but intellectually, there is still positivity to be derived from Brexit? I know it's, you know, kind of anathema to say in this country, and especially in this city and the audience, but, you know, I think there is a balance between, we're kind of saying that encouraging, you're mentioning different parts of localism or ideas that are stemming from kind of grassroots organisation, all the rest, but we're kind of at a dichotomy where we're constantly encouraging people to think locally, encouraging new ideas, and yet you know, each one of us in this room is just part of the establishment. So, one, can you see any positives for the UK deriving from Brexit? And two, how do we reconcile the fact that we're trying to be encouraging? You know, you say, oh, let's encourage young people. No, it's more like let's brainwash young people into accepting the status quo, accepting these large institutions and accepting who is currently in power. So, you know, how do you kind of see that
Right.
for yourself?
Okay.
What good can come of Brexit? Should we take one more, and then that may
Go ahead.
have to be the last round, I think, because
My name is Bernard Vergne. I used to work for Microsoft. I was the first president and chairman for Europe and Middle East and Africa. Just looking forward to 12, 18 months, based on your understanding of this fractured continent you wrote about a year ago, what are the 2, 3, or 5 things that would positively influence the future of Europe, and what are the 2 or 3 that would negatively crash further the fractured continent?
Okay.
great. So the first one,
Always difficult to be a fortune teller, Bernard, but anyway, I'll try. Well, let me start with the UK question. if I
what
may.
good can come of Brexit, I think she asked.
Well, actually, and I think you raise an interesting point. I think people voted for Brexit for, you know, honest and maybe honorable motives in their sense. They wanted to regain control over their daily lives. Part of that reaction against globalization that I talked about, that people want to be governed more closer to their own communities. But I don't think the ramifications were thought through properly. I mean, first of all, I think it was a blunder by David Cameron to call the referendum during the week of final exams. He was confident that 90% of the young people would turn out in massive numbers to vote in favor of staying in the European Union. Well, by calling it during the week of the final exams and on the eve of the Glastonbury Music Festival, most students were either studying feverishly for their final exam that day or else out partying and recovering from their hangovers or something, and were not incentivized to vote. But I think the longer term, but that being said, 52-48, and for everything I talk and friends is saying it's still evenly divided. If there were a referendum today, it probably would tilt in favor of leaving as well. So there we have it. But what will be the economic consequences? And I think these are the most serious ones, particularly when you consider foreign investors. I mean, there are Japanese plants in Sunderland that employ a considerable number. They're already thinking of packing up and moving to the continent. Why did they invest there? They invested because they thought Britain was a member of the European Union and would stay there. So I think that's something that is going to, longer term, have damaging economic consequences.
Positives, can you think positives? Can you think of successes that can emerge from it instead of what we've had that same quote, we're well aware since the day after the referendum that's an issue, but can you see, even intellectually, what the positives might be for Europe? Because we're still Europeans, we're just not a member of a political union.
Yeah, but you're going to be now on the outside and having a more distant relationship, and Europeans will be taking decisions that, whether you like them or not, you will still have to live with them. I mean, you can be very satisfied and say, we're now more English than ever, and we don't have to pay attention to those on the outside. But anyway, I wish you luck. I hope you enjoy.
I would say there are 2 possible positives. One is that the British are going to have to try that much harder just to achieve what they had as members in terms of access, in terms of success in the markets, and in terms of influence. And maybe that will motivate people to raise their game. So maybe that might be one thing. The other thing, of course, is from a European perspective, it removes one great alibi for Europe, doesn't it? That, you know, we would have loved to have done this and that in Europe if only the British hadn't stopped us. Well, now the British aren't going to be in the room to stop you. So will the EU now advance to do all those things that weren't being done before, or will we discover that lots of other countries
Right.
were hiding behind the Brits?
Right. They won't have Britain to blame anymore.
They won't have Britain to kick around any longer.
Right.
So,
Okay, two more points.
Yeah.
Martin, on your question and your point about working with a stronger Russia, I entirely agree with you. I think there should be channels of cooperation. As you point out, in academia, there are. I mean, unfortunately, in the United States, this investigation and the collusion has whipped up a hysteria reminiscent of the McCarthy era, even in the 50s, when there was this great fear of Russian communism taking over. But I think you're absolutely right. There's no question the education system in Russia, particularly in terms of mathematics, trains people extremely well. We've already seen, you know, their scientists, the scientific exchanges that still go on between the United States and Russia are extremely valuable. And I would only hope that this dialogue continues, and I would hope that at some point it will lead to a political realization on both sides that maybe this cycle of negativity has to change. We have to get back to a period of more positive responses, because the Russians have they have their own grievances too against what we have done in the West and the way we have acted. I mean, even to the point of intruding in their political system. I mean, people forget that it was American political advisors were involved in getting Boris Yeltsin elected on the ground. There wasn't a big outcry about collusion in those days.
and, you know, American organizations and NGOs, and probably with government encouragement, were also involved in encouraging the revolutions that occurred in Georgia and Ukraine and so on as well.
Right. Yeah, and I think, and this is where it all began. I think the Maidan Square demonstrations frightened Putin so much that he thought this was going to spread to Moscow, and that's when he ordered, according to the Mueller prosecuting documents, that's when he ordered this attempt to, particularly because he was convinced that Hillary Clinton was behind it, in encouraging the Maidan demonstration, and was determined to undermine him and eventually overthrow Putin. And finally, on Bernard.
Finally, what can go right?
Yeah.
What can go wrong?
What can go wrong? What can go right?
What more wrong mistakes could Europe make?
I think I hope that it'll take advantage of this upswing, economic upswing that is taking place, and use this to make some important reforms. I think one of the best uses of this period of optimism would be to find ways to get young people under 30s into sustainable jobs, because you're facing a situation where, particularly as we see in Spain, a lost generation. People have been unemployed, haven't been able to get traction in their professional lives, and because they can't get a steady job, they can't start a family and move on. I think this is reflected elsewhere. There's got to be a way to the generational change in political leadership that we witnessed with Macron taking power in France needs to be seen on an economic level as well, moving to a new generation of economic leadership in France. And as Macron himself says, he wants to encourage, you know, France to become a country of startups, entrepreneurial. It's encouraging to hear, and I see it even in Berlin when I go to Germany, there's more and more of an attitude of we need to depend on ourselves rather than the state. And so I think that's where the United States, at least in California where I grew up, the entrepreneurial attitude has been much more pronounced than we've seen in Europe. But, you know, there's certainly the The resources, the talent, and the assets that Europe has can bring it to a much better level than it is now.
So fractured but not yet broken.
No, and I think it's the political landscape may be more fragmented than ever before, but that doesn't mean it can't be repaired and brought to a better level. And maybe Europe is better off not being a United States of Europe. Maybe a fragmented regional approach, as you alluded to earlier on, would be the best way of making Europe work in the long run.
Thank you very much. Microsoft would like you to have a drink now in the next room. I'm sure you'd all like Bill to sign you a copy of his book, so please buy it outside so he can sign it for you. And just remains to thank Bill Drozdiak for a fascinating exposition of a fascinating book.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shall we?